Now, I think that the right question to ask before we start is, we know Rashi died in the year 1105. From my calculation, that's 911 years ago. It's a long time ago. And the question that we should ask, and maybe that should be kind of beneath the surface of our discussion today, is why would someone who died so long ago yet be so relevant today? Why are we having this discussion of a biographical discussion of trying to discuss and analyze and probe the legacy of a great scholar that lived almost 1,000 years ago? He was born in 1040. That's in 15 years, and whatever. I guess in 25 years, 24 years, we're going to reach the 1,000-year mark of his birth. And this is a long time ago. And the question I think we should be asking is, how is it possible for someone to be so relevant so many years, or more specifically, what about his contribution to Jewish life and to the world in general makes his name still reverberate today? Why does it matter? And I think the way to approach that is to kind of look back at the discussion we had about the Rambam. If you guys remember, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, whatever it was, we had a discussion about Maimonides. And I know I've played this game before with students in yeshiva. Who was the most impactful person of the last 1,000 years, I guess, in the Jewish world? And invariably, the two answers are either Rashi or Maimonides. And I haven't heard a different answer.
Is it specifically limited to scriptural, or could it be a contemporary Jew?
Well, it could be anyone. Anyone in the last 1,000 years. The answer is always either Rashi or Maimonides. And I think the way to kind of encapsulate it before we go into the details is that when we studied the Rambam, when we talked about Maimonides, what we learned was that he took something that was very hard, was impossible for us to grasp, and he made it accessible. And he took what I call halacha, or Jewish living, which was out there. It was in the Talmud. If you read all of the Talmud and you were a tremendous scholar and you knew how to compare and contrast all the different parts of the Talmud against each other, and you understood all the nuances, and you were a tremendous scholar, you would know halacha. You would know how to live as a Jew. But what about the rest of us? What about the people that aren't the scholars? What about the people that, remember, at that time, we're deep into the Crusades already.
Very impactful because of the influence that they got. Even those non-scholars are still influenced by...
That's right.
And
to live as a Jew,
right.
Jewish living is not possible today. It means if we remove the Rambam from the equation, we wouldn't be able to live today as Jews. Because we would have no idea where to start. Because the Rambam set into motion an entire realm of study, or of scholarship, which kind of collected and distilled and synthesized all of Jewish learning, of Jewish halacha, from the Talmud and from all the associated books, and wrote down in an organized fashion. And in his introduction to his magnum opus, to the Mishnah Torah, he writes, he says, all you need to know how to live as a Jew is the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, the Chumash, the Torah, the written Torah, simple, and this book. That's it. I'll take all of Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, Sifra, Sifri, Mechilot Torah Kohanim, all the associated medrashes, all the things that are unwritten, and I'll write them all down and organize them by topic. Laws of Torah study, laws of behavior, laws of Shemitah, laws of Passover, laws of a lulav, laws of a mezuzah, laws of charity, like we discussed when we talked about the laws of charity. Any topic of Jewish life, including, by the way, the ritualistic and sacrificial laws, which weren't in application, he organized them law by law, subject by subject, one after another. Indeed, it's very fair to say that the Rambam made it possible for us to live as Jews, to behave as Jews, to know what to do as a Jew. And indeed, of course, he spawned a lot of competition, or a lot of imitators, and as all the great ones do. And that we find that after the Rambam, we meet other commentators that did the same thing. And then we meet someone like the Shulchan Aruch, like Rabbi Joseph Cairo, who wrote what's called the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, which is like a compendium of, or a synthesis of all the preceding commentaries, which are all predicated, all based upon the Rambam's model. Indeed, I think it's a very fair argument to say that organizing Jewish law in a way that makes it accessible was kicked off by the Rambam. Now, where does Rashi fit into this? I would say, if I had to say, I would say like as follows. I would say, if the Rambam made Jewish living possible, Rashi made Jewish learning possible, Jewish study possible. Indeed, we find that his contemporaries write about him, which is always interesting, where to kind of look at how someone's legacy gets shaped over time. Sometimes it takes a while for greatness to be appreciated. Right? The Rambam himself, as a good example, had a lot of detractors in his time. The Rambam is the one who starts writing the Principles of Faith, which was tremendously controversial. Who is this young man to tell us what are principles of faith? The Rambam is a 24-year-old who's writing this. And I'll tell you the 30 principles of faith. These are principles and everything else is not principles. What do you mean? All of Torah is principles. And he had a lot of detractors about that. But, he was someone that over time, the Jewish people in their totality had accepted him as the last word in Jewish philosophy.
Was he considered a wonderkind when he was studying Rashi?
Oh, all of them were. I'm saying you look at the literary accomplishments of the Rambam and of Rashi as well, and it's impossible to imagine for us someone to do so much so well in such a short amount of time.
But was he recognized when he was studying?
So we'll talk about his childhood. We'll talk a little bit about his childhood, and we'll see.
Mothers were very proud.
But most certainly. It is interesting. You look at we know that the Rambam was a very busy. He was a very very busy physician. Yet he wrote, several books that are unmatched in their scope and their scholarship and their depth in any domain.
And didn't he do a bunch of it when he was just like a teenager?
Yeah, like when he's a teenager hiding in caves from radical Muslims, the Almohads. He's hiding in caves in northern Morocco, in the Atlas Mountains.
But he also only slept a couple hours a night. I mean, he lives like that, seriously.
Yeah, it's otherworldly for us.
He was also getting some sort of, I don't know what it was like involved at the time, but he got a medical degree somehow with all this.
He was the court physician.
Yeah,
He was the court physician in Cairo.
At the time. You just
All
So
physicians
how
were
do you
self-taught.
get designated a physician?
you train with the different physicians and you prove yourself, right?
But there were credentials of some sort, I assume.
I was a
So to
student
put
of
it in
so-and-so.
perspective, what is the
He
time
died, you come to me.
elapsed between Rambam and...
Okay, so Rashi was born in the year 1040 and he died in the year 1105. There is this legend that Rashi met the Rambam, which is obviously not possible because the Rambam was only born 30 years after Rashi died. Yeah.
I'm getting confused on the names. Rambam?
Yes.
And
Maimonides.
Maimonides
They're
are
the
the
Same person, that's right.
And Rashi is just Rashi? Or does he
Just
have a-
Rashi. That's it. His name is Rabbi Shlomo, and then the Rashi is an acronym. It's interesting because you look at the scholars of the time; they were all called by their acronym. Rabbi Etz, the son of Etz. So Rambam is Rabbi Moshe ben, which means the son of Maimon. His father's name was Maimon. That's why he's called Maimonides. If you hear the term Nachmanides, that's Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. So his father was Nachman. It's called Nachmanides. Rashi is Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak. His father's name was Yitzchak. And the reason why he's not called Rashbi, which is what all his contemporaries are, Rabbi Shimon ben Yitzchak, is because there already was a Rashbi. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was one of the most frequently named members of the Mishnah, authors of the Mishnah. Of course, very famously, according to Jewish tradition, is the author of the Zohar, but he's the one who also escaped from the Romans and was hiding in a cave for 12 years, ended up being 13 years. One of the great heroes in Jewish history. He was already called Rashbi. So I think that's the reason why they call him just Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, which means the son of Yitzchak. Now his acronym also has other connotations. a resh shin yud could also be spelled as, or could also be elaborated as Rabban Shel Yisrael, the teacher of Israel, because indeed that was the function that he played. Indeed, today it becomes, it's perplexing to us how Jewish study was even possible before Rashi. He became so indispensable to Jewish learning that to us, like if we would remove Rashi from the equation, the Talmud would be a sealed book. And like we said, sometimes it takes many generations or many years of reflection to appreciate the greatness of someone's contribution. But his contemporaries already write that Rashi made the Talmud, and of course, which he wrote a commentary on all of Talmud, which is, to study all of Talmud is a great feat if someone's able to do that. Certainly to write a commentary on all of Talmud would be astounding. To write a commentary that became so indispensable that the books of the Talmud that don't have his commentary, the few books that don't have his commentary, and I studied some of them, it's so much harder to study Talmud without Rashi. Yes, he has his imitators. There are those that say, okay, Rashi didn't write for whatever reason on this particular book. I'm going to do his, I'm going to fill his shoes, but his shoes aren't filled. And you feel it. And I know for myself, there's the book of Nazir doesn't have Rashi, doesn't have a later edition of Rashi. We'll see Rashi edited his work several times. The book of Nadarim doesn't have Rashi, or it has a primitive version of Rashi.
Why did he not write on, did he die
Well,
before he could? Or?
Well, he only lived to 65.
Right.
And he wrote a commentary on all of Tanakh, all of the Jewish Bible, what's known as the Old Testament in modern lexicon. He wrote on all of Talmud. Now, we know that we know that he wrote it several times. So there are certain books of the Talmud that we only have, let's say, the first edition, but not the revised and edited and perfected second and third edition.
And there's translation issues too, right? In between.
Well, there's translation issues with all the words. You read the Talmud is written in Aramaic.
Right.
The Torah is written in Hebrew. Most of the Tanakh is written in Hebrew. Some parts of the Tanakh are written in Aramaic. And you have an obscure word that there's no corollary. And by the way, Rashi will tell you if there's no corollary. It's interesting. You read Rashi's and you're like, and you have to remember, this is with all without computers, right? He'll tell you every place that word is written. If there's an obscure word, he'll say, this word means X, he'll translate it, and very frequently he'll give you the French translation for it as well, because he lived in France. And he'll tell you, there are 4 other places in all of Jewish writings where this word appears. And he'll enumerate them one after another, and he'll say, okay, this is what it means in all different places. And then sometimes he'll say, there's no other corollary for this in all of Jewish writing. This is the only time that this word appears, and that happens frequently. And he'll tell you what that word means. But can you imagine how you have to know all of Tanakh by heart? Just the enormous amount of volume that you have to know by heart to just even consider writing such a commentary?
Probably an autodidact, right?
What does that
Perfect recall.
Perfect what?
Perfect recall.
Well, it must have a tremendous, like we said, so was he a wonder kid? Who knows? But he was certainly gifted and talented.
For certain.
So, it's funny because this feels like a deeply personal discussion for me, because in a yeshiva environment, everything is inexorably tied to Rashi. You don't learn the text of the Talmud without consulting Rashi. It's not like it's a commentary. There's thousands upon thousands and thousands of commentaries on the Talmud. Thousands, literally thousands. And probably tens of thousands of commentaries. The one commentary that's indispensable, that you cannot skip, that no one skips, is Rashi. Everything else, you say, well, I do this, I don't do that, I'm looking at this, I'm studying that, there's an interesting commentary here, an interesting there. Rashi, no one skips because you can't study Talmud without it. You don't understand Remember, the Talmud is not written with punctuations. And the Talmud, by its nature, is written very briefly. It's trying to say with as minimal words as possible, convey its ideas. The no punctuation, you don't know is this a statement or is this a question, or is this puzzlement?
It's a seed.
Right? He gives you all that, in his commentary, like translation of words, explanation of kind of between the lines. If you read Talmud, there's so many things that are being implied. That is why it's so hard. Like it takes you a day to study one page, or even a month to study one. How does it take you a day to study one page? I can read a page of anything, in maybe 10 minutes, 20 minutes. You read a page of Talmud, like every line is a discussion, but it's written in 4 words, because there's everything between the words that it's not being written, and you have to unpack that all with Rashi.
Read between the lines.
But it's more. It's all there. It's all hidden, and Rashi kind of unlocks the Talmud for us. To try to study the Talmud without Rashi it's maddening. What's going on over here? Like, orient me. I'm lost.
So does Rashi ever write about contemporary things?
Yes. What's interesting is that Rashi was a tremendous scholar of
What was his
all these
thoughts
different
on,
domains.
homosexuality. Did he talk about in any of his writings things that would have been a part of the society in which he lived?
So that's interesting. Rashi submits himself to the text. Rashi doesn't go off on tangents. One of the reasons why Rashi is so beloved is because he sticks to the page. You look at other commentaries on the Torah, on Talmud. Like I said, Rashi is the one that did a comprehensive commentary on both. Rashi is the first commentary of his kind on the Talmud, and not quite replicated.
When you say
but
sticks to the
so
page, do you mean the literal word, or I'm curious?
Yeah, I'll explain what I mean. So there's a verse in the Torah, right? The verse is talking about whatever it's talking about. Rashi will keep you in the page. He won't bring you elsewhere. He won't say, well, in 4 other places, unless he's trying to translate a word, of course. But this theme is found here and it's found there. He is explaining to you what you're reading. You want to read the text of the Torah? You want to know what it means? You look at Rashi. He's not going to take you on these elaborate journeys throughout the worlds of scholarship. You study Talmud. Now, very frequently, there's a theme in a Talmud that is repeated elsewhere. There may be 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 different places where this item is discussed. And then you'll have the great commentators and the great scholars that will take all those 10 sources and organize them and say, are they disagreeing or not? Well, they appear to be disagreeing, but are they really? But what's the context of that? What's the context of here? Let's contrast them. Well, maybe there's a question. Wait a minute. Here it says this, and you look at the other end of the Talmud, it says that. What's going on? Is there a disagreement? Like, Rashi never does that. Rashi will keep you reading the text of the Talmud. This is what it means. So he doesn't go on any elaborate discussions. And that's why one of the interesting pursuits of certainly in the Talmud, is to try to glean from Rashi that he doesn't say. For example, you have a particularly naughty portion of Talmud, which is almost any portion of Talmud, because that's the way it's written. And it's it's very dense. It's very delicate. Where kind of everything is kind of hinging on these hairs, right? That's what the Talmud itself is described. Is that imagine you have a mountain that's balancing on a hair. That's how volatile it is. Such big discussions and kind of with every hesitation of the text of the Talmud, you're not sure which way it's going. And you finish it, and you want to kind of organize it and try to extract some sort of conclusion.
Like the last 2 parshas.
Another example of something but imagine trying to look at the Talmudic text of that. Yeah. So you want to pull conclusions. Rashi doesn't give you conclusions. Remember, Rashi is taking your hand and walking with you step by step through the text that you're studying. Be it the Torah, be it the books of the prophets, be it the books of the Rashi, whatever it is, and certainly be it the Talmud. He's taking your hand. What does this mean? What does that mean? Where are we holding? What is the question? Let's understand the question. Let's elaborate it. Go ahead.
Well, Rabbi, I'm fascinated by this because how do you say he doesn't really form conclusions if he tells you what every specific thing means and doesn't go off on these tangents?
Yeah. So okay, because he's, like I said, he's working with you through the process.
But isn't he? So in other words, by telling you what each verse means, for lack of a better word. He's not concluding anything. He's just telling you what it means.
Well, what happens is that okay, you finish the section of the Talmud, and then you open up the commentaries and you see there's this wild disagreement about a certain nuance that's being discussed. and you'll have 5 opinions on one side, 5 on the other side. Just tremendous debate and scholarship.
So
and the
he
question
doesn't
you would
come to
have
the
is,
conclusion himself.
okay, what can we prove from the text of Rashi? What his position would be on this issue? Because remember, Rashi will not tell you his conclusion.
Okay, that's
Because he is working with you along the process. Right? And to even get through the process is impossible without him. You can't do it.
he wants to help you form your own conclusions, I guess.
No,
by knowing the
and the great scholars will spend a lot of time trying to extract from Rashi's treatment of the process what his conclusions were. He'll say one word. I can think of so many examples. It's funny because I was trying to. It's very hard to illustrate if you haven't actually done. I was thinking about bringing in some examples and say, okay, what's he saying or what's he not saying? Well, we have a few examples that I did select. I'll give you an example. It just popped into my head, right? So we spoke about this a few times. We know that in Jewish law, almost any Jewish law that stands in the way of me living and me continually living, we do away with, right? So if there's, for whatever reason, someone's diabetic and they need to eat food now and there's no kosher restaurants around, they would be allowed to, in fact, even encouraged to eat non-kosher to stay alive. You're having a heart attack, it's Shabbos. Right? Do you drive to the hospital, or do you light a candle if you need to, etc.? All those things we know we do away with all the laws in order to preserve a life. Now, why?
Because doesn't the Torah say you live by the commandments, not die by them?
Okay, so that's the verse in the Torah. These are the commandments, that a person does it, and he lives with them. You live with him, and you don't die with him. Okay, now listen to the disagreement between the commentaries. One opinion says like this. Indeed, let's say we didn't have that verse. Let's say if we remove the verse of you should live by them and not die by them. Let's say you remove that verse didn't exist. What would happen then? You'd have, that's what you would imagine, right?
I guess.
No,
Or you go to the next level.
You disagree?
I disagree, because when it comes to preserving life, the average person is going to do whatever it takes.
Okay, but we're not talking about the average person. The question is,
Talk about Rashi, not about this passage, right? Let's not discuss.
Well, it's connected, though. It's connected.
well, I'm saying, but if you, but
Human nature is to preserve life.
Okay, but let's work with this systematically. We have a verse, like Steve said, we have a verse that tells us that the verses are meant for us to live and not to die. And thus we know that if the verse is telling me to die, why don't listen to the verse? The verse is only telling me to live. But let's imagine that verse wasn't written.
You could make the argument.
The argument you would say is that,
The
okay.
argument, I mean, what is martyrdom? I mean, some people will, not in the Islamic radical sense, but I mean, just in general, some people do die for causes. And you could maybe make the argument that's God's will. If a diabetic can't get kosher food, I'm not saying I agree.
That's what you would make the argument,
I'm
correct?
just saying, and that might be totally consistent with what God's will is.
And I agree with you. However,
I'm not saying I agree
we
with it.
find an opinion that says like this. Listen to this. And like we said, like the verse does say something. Obviously, we need the verse for something, because otherwise we wouldn't have the verse. So simply, we would say that the verse is telling us that we wouldn't know otherwise. I.e., that if we didn't have the verse, we would indeed have to give up our lives for any infraction. That's what you would think. Comes along the verse, says, no, the verse, the Torah, the mitzvahs are given us for us to live and not to die, and therefore we don't give up our lives for minor infractions, with the exception of the 3 cardinal sins.
And if you save one life, you've saved all of humanity.
True. Says the commentary called the Tosafos. Right? Tosafos actually is a compendium of different commentaries that was part of the legacy of Rashi, because he established a school in France. We know that we'll talk about his life story in a little bit. He established a school, and his descendants, his sons-in-law, he didn't have any sons. His daughters, of course, are very famous. He didn't have any sons, so his sons-in-law and his grandchildren, they headed a magnificent institution that ultimately they wrote a commentary on the Talmud called the Tosafos. And they say as follows, Tosafos, which means the additions. And it's like an addition to Rashi. And you'll see in every page of the Talmud, you have the text of the Talmud in the middle, and then in the inner margin, you'll have the text of Rashi, and the outer margin, you have the text of Tosafos. There's a Tosafos like this. We know that the Torah says that there's 3 mitzvahs that you are not allowed to transgress to save your life. Adultery, murder, and idolatry. And these are each learned with separate verses, or separate sources, not quite verses. Some of them are verses, some of them are sources. The sources say that you have to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, even if it means giving up your life. I.e., you cannot do idolatry to save your life. Says Tosfos. Indeed, if we didn't have the verse of you should live by them and not die by them, you would still know that you're allowed to transgress sin to save your life, like Janet said. However, now that we have the 3 cardinal sins that we're told specifically that you have to give up your life and not transgress, we would have compared those sins to other sins, and thus we would have extended that requirement to give up your life in martyrdom to other mitzvahs. And in order to say not to think like that, we were told you should live by them and not die by them. I know it's a little complex, right?
That's
but
good.
It's good. Okay, good. We're good.
Yeah.
So this is way off the page. Like, this is not on the page at all. Like, this, you can see how this kind of goes. This is like a discussion, a conclusion of, the text of Talmud talks about, well, every mitzvah that you're told, you either do the mitzvah and you die, or you transgress the mitzvah and you live. You transgress the mitzvah and you live.
That's proof.
Besides for three. And then off this page we have this very kind of delicate discussion as to what is the exact mechanism of what role does the verse play? Does the verse actually tell you that you're allowed to give up your life, that you're allowed to transgress to save your life? Or does it only tell you that we don't extend the requirement to give up your life to other mitzvahs? And I remember when we were learning this section in Talmud, the question that was asked was, what does Rashi say? And by the way, the second question was also asked, what does the Rambam say? Got to look at the text of the Rambam, because he doesn't discuss it outright. So what can we deduce from what he says and what he does not say, and what he says and where he says what he says, which is also interesting. Because the way the Rambam organized it is all by design. So thus the placement of a certain law would also tell you about what he thinks about the law, which is, incredible. Like, his order, just how he organizes this thing, is so precise that the fact that he placed it here and not there will tell you a lot about what he thinks about that. But what does Rashi say? So we were able to prove from what Rashi said and what Rashi didn't say that Rashi indeed disagreed with Tosafot, and he believed that indeed without this verse you would have to give up your life. As an example. You can see why I maybe didn't want to do this, because it's like, whoa, we're going way off our page, so to speak. But this is very interesting. Like, the scholarship of Rashi, it's one of the themes that we'll see again and again, is that Rashi is what you study the first time you learn Chumash, and Rashi is what you study when you're already an advanced scholar, and you've studied Chumash 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times even, and Rashi kind of scales up with you. Like, you cannot read the verse without Rashi. Okay, so just to have a rudimentary understanding of what's going on here, you read Rashi. You're an advanced scholar and you're trying to understand the depths, you also look at Rashi, because Rashi kind of is able to fill wherever you are in your scholarship, Rashi's there with you. Simplistically, just to understand what's going on, just orient me. Very advanced, try to understand and trying to glean and extract from the nuances of what Rashi says and what Rashi doesn't and how he says it. And couldn't he have said this? Question that, like, we asked a lot in Talmud. Like, question you don't hear other people say. Let's examine a text. Wouldn't it have been better if he said it this way? Which is a bizarre question. No, this is the way he said it, right? Why are you trying to improve Rashi? The answer is because I cannot possibly improve Rashi. If Rashi didn't say the way I think perhaps is a better way to say it, indeed it's not a better way to say it, and the question is why? Why can't I improve the text of Rashi? Because he's better than me, by orders of magnitude. So from the fact that he didn't say it in this way that I think would be better...
It's just that it's the way it is.
Well, but it's the way it is for a reason.
Exactly, but so it's there. You couldn't improve on it if you were there and you were good. You might do that same capability.
Wait
You can just grow on it. It's great.
If he's a human being, or he was a human being.
Yes.
Okay. So he was. We were all imperfect. So what says that everything that Rashi said is perfect, and everybody who disagrees with him is imperfect or wrong?
Well, that's the thing, because Rashi will always have people that disagree. In fact, his grandchildren, who are the primary architects of the Tosafos, they disagree with him all the time. So the point is not that he's infallible, but the point is that even when they disagree with him, there's a difference between a disagreement based upon a legitimate argument on either side and a disagreement based upon a mistake. Rashi's not going to make any gross mistakes, clearly. No one ever says that. What they'll say is, I know what you're saying, it makes sense what you're saying, however, I say something else. And what I'm saying makes more sense, or I have evidence that I'm right. But no one's ever going to say that Rashi made a mistake in calculation or in organizing of his thoughts. Thus, if his thoughts are what you would think are maybe not optimally organized, then that tells you something about what Rashi is thinking. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not claiming this.
You're making him into a god.
No, I'm not. I'm not. I'm just saying. I'm not saying that he's infallible. There's no papal infallibility here. But the point is that he's well thought out. Thus, and that's the way has always been said. By the way, his temperance also. Of course. Yes, of course.
A tzaddik is meaning as a person who get to some spiritual level, I guess, right?
Yeah, no one's saying that he's perfect and never sinned. There's no one who doesn't sin. That's right. We know that.
I was in a Torah class many years ago, and the guy that led the Torah class, there were many times that he thought Rashi was just a little nutso. He had other sources for whatever it was we were discussing.
I want to tell you what happened once here. It happened in a class. I got to the second, Stephen. I guess you wanted to contribute. We had a class. My brother was given a class on Shabbos in one of the synagogues in our neighborhood. And there was this argument that started to develop about what something meant. So I said to him, so there was some guy there, very, very passionate and assured of himself individual, was saying, now this is what it means. I said, well, let's look at Rashi. Rashi seems to disagree with you. So he said, listen, Rashi's a human being, I'm a human being. Rashi says something, and this is what I'm saying. I said to him, sir, excuse me, right, but you're not worth the dust under Rashi's feet. That's what I told him. He's like, what? And it's funny, because I said that, because I was like, he was treating Rashi as, kind of...
A flake.
Yeah, he was mistreating Rashi. Like he said, Rashi's a human being, I'm a human being. And I said to him, sir, you're not worth the dust under Rashi's feet. And then I was thinking about it, I still stand by what I said. He's still not worth, and I don't think I'm worth either the dust under Rashi's feet.
It doesn't sound like you.
It doesn't, right? I just...
You gotta have something to apologize for.
Yeah, well, I did apologize to him, but I said to him that there's a Gemara that talks about the dust of... There's a few times it talks about the dust of the tzaddikim. And to sit in the dust of the tzaddikim is a big merit. Right? We should try to always sit in the dust of the tzaddikim, to submit ourselves to them. So I said it's not that bad of a barb.
Oh, okay.
It
So
depends on the person receiving the barb.
He took it fine. He was
spiritually.
I guess of all the people that I could have said that to,
You were
but
lucky to get out alive.
yeah,
That's Texas.
Yes, exactly. But I still stand by what I said. So I'm not retracting it because. Really, we have to appreciate Rashi. Rashi is, remember, his acronym is, many people say, the word Rashi stands for Rabbon Shel Yisrael, the teacher of Israel. And we know, you ask any student of the Torah, certainly a student of the Talmud, what would your life in scholarship be without Rashi? And the answer, if they're being honest, it would be that it's in shambles, incomplete, because it's unfathomable to us today how scholarship and study was possible before Rashi. It's so indispensable, Steve.
I need you to clarify something. If you've already gone through it and I missed it, I apologize. But did you just say a few minutes ago that when we're talking about with or without the verse about you live by them, you die by them?
Yes.
Not die by them. Did you say that Rashi said that? But then I'm trying to connect it with the three things that you don't do: even adultery, murder, and what was it?
Idolatry.
Idolatry. Okay, so I'm still not clear on what Rashi's saying the conclusion is. So even with that verse, it's still unacceptable to do murder, adultery.
Well, clearly, everyone agrees to the law. The Talmud establishes the law, and that is all the other 610 mitzvahs you're allowed, in fact, even encouraged to transgress and not die. But these three, you're encouraged to give up your life. However, the mechanics of that and how this verse plays in is in disagreement, right? What would happen without that verse is the question. If we didn't have that verse, what would we think? According to one opinion, we would think that you would still transgress and save your life. And according to Rashi's opinion, what's clearly borne out from what he says and what he doesn't say, it's clear that he believes that if we did not have that verse, we would be required to give up our lives for everything. But I'm saying that's not. Rashi himself doesn't spell that out, but that's all extracted from his text.
It's just part of he's just saying this is the process. But is he basically implying then therefore to save a life, however whacked out this is, to save a life, it's okay to murder, and because of that provision,
no, of course not.
It's
of course
okay
not. Of course not.
Cases.
No. Everyone agrees to the law in the sum total of the law. Everyone agrees that we give up our lives and not transgress murder, idolatry, and adultery, and we transgress every other sin. Okay? Everyone agrees to that law that the Talmud itself establishes. However, the mechanics of how the verse of you shall live by them and not die by them, what that actually contributes towards this law is what's in flux. According to one opinion, it's just telling you to not compare these three cardinal sins to everywhere else. And according to Rashi, it itself is telling you that that you're allowed to give up, that you're allowed to transgress to save a life.
Is it another way of saying that these are such egregious sins? That there is basically there's no justification under any sort.
Clearly, that's borne out in the Talmud itself. The only thing that we're discussing right now is what role does that verse play.
Okay, I'm
saying, but
it's
yes, and by the way, how would that make a difference is an interesting question. Like this is way beyond like I said, this is beyond the page of what the Talmud actually says.
I just think it's ironic because in today's society, adultery is a joke.
With that one.
To think that's considered so egregious, and I think it is. Don't get me wrong, because of the implications that it does to society, and to children and all that. But still, it's kind of in Europe. If you don't sleep around, you're considered as a politician. You're considered kind of a flake. It's getting that way.
It doesn't happen in the United States.
It's getting that way here.
Now, now that you brought that up, we'll go way off topic now as well here. If you remember what happened with Abraham, so Abraham has Sarah. She's really beautiful, and he's traveling to Egypt, and he tells his wife, "Make believe that you're my sister, cause if you're my wife, they'll kill me to have you." Remember that?
Yes.
Yeah, something about it.
Well, what does that imply?
Because
why do they need to kill him?
He's trying to find a loophole, because he's committing adultery. If it's not.
So what's clear is that in ancient societies, adultery was a big no-no, but murder happened every day.
Yeah, still does.
So if
Say that again.
I'm saying it's clear that in the Egyptian society of the time, adultery was, unheard of, was the most taboo thing possible. But murder, that's okay. So Abraham is saying, if you're my wife, they'll murder me because they want you. Well, why would they murder you? Just take her by force. Well, that's adultery. That's a no-no.
That implies that he's giving up Sarah to be raped anyway. It's just that he's not getting killed first.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a good question. That's a question. What was Abraham thinking? What was the end game here? And ironically, she wasn't raped.
Well, that's good, but
Yeah.
But it wasn't for lack of nothing that it didn't happen.
Well, okay, but maybe Abraham knew maybe Abraham could spell this out. It's a good question. You're asking a good question. It's a good question. But let's.
Biography.
Yeah, I know, but let's. Yes.
Before somebody gets raped or something.
But clearly we see that in ancient societies, they viewed adultery as much worse than murder, and our society has flipped the coin. Now, which one is right, which one's wrong? Well, the Torah says that they're both wrong. That adultery is unacceptable, and murder, we certainly agree that it's unacceptable.
And in regards to the idolatry, we have the example of the three young men who, in Daniel, who, the decree went out, you've got to bow down to this statue, and we won't do it. And they said, we don't know if our God will save us or not, but we do know this, we will not do that.
Absolutely, and there's many examples like that. We're talking about Rashi's time. Rashi lived in the run-up to the Crusades, the first Crusades in 1096, right? So he lived for the majority of his life in very calm and, at least relative, a facade of tranquility in Europe. That was going to change in a major, major way in the end of his life. We know that Rashi at the end of his life had to flee France, like many of.
We don't know yet.
Oh, we don't know that. Okay, but we know that he died in the year 1105, and so at the age of 55, he's writing this tremendous commentary on all of Torah, all of Talmud. He has a student. He has a yeshiva of many, many students, the biggest yeshiva in France, and now the Crusades are happening. And think about what kind of chaos that engenders in his life. But we know that throughout the course of history, the past 1,000 years, there's many, many examples of Jews that have given up their lives to prevent or to avoid idolatry or any variant of idolatry, and to stay true to their faith. So there's many examples like that, even in modern contemporary times.
So you had
Now,
Spanish Inquisition.
Of course, many, many, many examples of that there. Okay, so let's talk about Rashi's contributions. So Rashi said he wrote a commentary on all of Torah, all of Tanakh, all of Talmud. Not only that, he spawned hundreds, if not thousands, of what's known as super commentaries. A super commentary is a commentary on a commentary. Wow. We know that the Ramban Nachmanides, who lived 100 and some odd years later, he wrote a tremendous commentary on the Torah, but it's actually a commentary on Rashi's commentary on the Torah. But there's hundreds and hundreds of commentaries written on Rashi as well. So we know he was born, we don't know, but he was born in Troyes, which is spelled Troyes, but somehow the French pronounce it Troyes, in the year 1040. His father we know his name was Rabbi Yitzchak. We don't know a lot of details, but I'll tell you stories. There are stories that have been said over and over and over about Rashi's, before Rashi's birth, that have repeated so often, it's unclear if it's legend or it's in fact history. But we know Rashi's an only child, and his father this is a story that hasn't been verified, but it's been said so often, and I've heard it so many times. Maybe it's a legend, maybe it's true, but his father was a gem dealer. And apparently he had this really exquisite gem that the church, the local church, had set its eyes on it, and they wanted to use it for some sort of adornment to a certain cross. And Rabbi Yitzchak, really pious Jew, is like, no way, I'm not selling my gem to have it adorn some cross. So he refused to sell him, and they finally courted him to put him on a boat. And they were forcing him, on pain of death, you better sell it to us. We'll pay you what it costs, but sell us this gem. So he takes the gem and he flings it into the sea and said, I'd rather lose this tremendous gem, this tremendous stone, rather than have it adorn some Christian, some Catholic vestment. And the legend goes that, or the story goes, that there was this prophetic announcement that you gave up the gem, but you'll have a gem that will outshine the gem that you lost. That's the story. And of course, we know that his son became Rashi, who is a gem that we still cherish till this day. That's one story. Whether or not it's true or whether or not it was embellished, like I said, I'm saying that caveat. I don't know, but I've heard it many times, and it's a well-known story that's been said over and over. Another story that's been told that his parents moved to Worms during his gestational period. So they're in Worms in what's now Germany, and she was walking in a very narrow alley. And in the distance, a carriage, a horse, was barreling towards her. It was really narrow, and she was going to be crushed. And suddenly this crevice appeared in the wall, and she was able to find refuge in the crevice and stay alive, and of course, preserve her precious embryo that would come on, that would become Rashi. This legend or story goes on to say that the crevice is still visible in Worms, even though I haven't seen any pictures online of it. Either way, whether that story is true or not, it does clearly demonstrate the impact and the legacy and the lore of Rashi till this day.
Which part of France is Troyes?
Troyes is in a place, I think it's in northern France. It's in it's
Near Germany, obviously.
Yes. Okay, we don't know much about Rashi's childhood. We know that he was an only child, which obviously would lend credence to this idea of him being born out of this miracle, or this, in merit of his father. Maybe they were infertile or whatever, and in merit of some great deed that his parents did, they merited to have a child. Who knows? We don't know much about his childhood. We do know that he went to study Torah in the yeshiva. Now we know that at that time there was a tremendous institution in Worms, and we know that he studied by a fellow by the name of Rabbi Yaakov ben Yakar. What's interesting about Rashi is that, unlike all his contemporaries, it's very hard to trace his rabbinic legacy. We know that he is a descendant of King David via one of the authors of the Mishnah. That is well known. What isn't so well known as to exactly who he received his Torah education for. He writes in his commentaries of his teachers, primarily Rabbi Yaakov ben Yakar, as his primary teacher, other teachers as well that he does mention in his commentaries as my teacher. But these are not as well known as the other scholars who taught and spawned other students.
I didn't know he was a descendant of King David.
Oh, yes.
So could he have been the Messiah?
It's possible. We know he's
Did he
not.
ever write that he thought he could be? Or?
He never wrote that. Remember, we have very little of Rashi's writing aside from his commentary. We do have responsa that he wrote. Remember, Rashi became a rabbi of his town when he moved back, being a rabbi and a Rosh Hashiva of his town. And the role of a rabbi was to answer halachic queries. So we do have about 300 halachic responsa that were collected together in a book. That's the ones that we have left. Undoubtedly, there were many, many others that are gone, that have disappeared into the annals of history. But besides for that, we really don't have a lot of Rashi's other writings. The Rambam wrote so many different kinds of writings. Or a commentary of all Mishnah. He collected all of halacha and organized it in a tremendously accessible fashion. We know that he wrote the letters, all these different kinds of letters. He wrote to different communities. He wrote, of course, books on philosophy. He wrote books on medicine. There's many, many books that we have today on medicine, all these different treatises and all these different kinds of exotic medicines. Rashi, we don't really have much aside from exhaustive commentary on all of Talmud and exhaustive commentary on all of Torah and Tanakh.
Did he ever see the Holy Land? Did he ever see Jerusalem? Or
It's unlikely. There is a legend that Rashi traveled to every little part, every Jewish community, and that would probably include the Jewish community, the small Jewish community in Israel, but it's unlikely that that's true. I think that to accomplish a lot in life, you probably have to sit down and buckle down. You know what I mean? It's very hard to be well-traveled and to be a scholar of note. We know the Rambam traveled a lot, but that was mostly based out of necessity. He was born in Spain. He spent some of his formative years in North Africa and moved to Egypt, had a cup of coffee, as they say, in Israel, but came back to Egypt. That we know, that's documented. But that was born out of necessity. The people that accomplish a lot of the people that dedicate themselves to their task. If you're going to write a monumental commentary on all of Torah and all of Talmud, it's probably not the best career advice for you to go on.
Speaking.
Or certainly not on Torah. So we know he did flee France in the end of his life to evade the brutality of the Crusades.
Does he go to Russia?
Not that I know of.
But there was no Russia at the time.
Well, the place that we now know is Russia.
It was steppes. There was
Yeah.
nothing there.
Okay, so there is a portrait. As to the accuracy of these portraits that are so old, who knows? There's this famous image of Rashi. If you Google it, you'll see a picture of him with a big beard, with a candle hovering over some manuscript. To say that would be an accurate depiction of him is I think, maybe a little bit of a stretch, because we know that he had a yeshiva. He had a very vibrant yeshiva, so he was engaged with students, and we could assume that his commentaries were not written in solitude and seclusion, but rather in collaboration, as is the best way to study, collaboration with other people to compare and contrast, and to have the gift of the untrained eye, or the unseasoned, or maybe not the if Rashi's for everyone. There's another example of this. There was another monumental book written in the late 19th, early 20th century called Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is a commentary on a section of the Shulchan Aruch. We're getting we're jumping a little bit over here, but it's written by someone who we know today as the Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan. He died in 1933, and when he had this is a book of very practical Jewish law, and he wrote the book, and his editors were laymen. And he specifically wanted lay people to read it over because he wanted it to be understood by lay people. If you are a great scholar and you're writing a book in seclusion, it's very likely going to be on your level. And it's on your level, it's very unhelpful, or not, it's not very useful for other people. We find this. I'm sure there's examples in every domain, but certainly in Jewish scholarship, we have two kinds of books. We have books that are very useful, and books that are very, this tremendous genius, but it's not written in a way that's very consumable for other people. I have an uncle. This is interesting. I have an uncle who's a Rosh Yeshiva in Israel, and he's a legitimate genius, like a wild genius. Like he has to have his glasses attached in the back, otherwise he'd lose them. And in his house, he has these stacks upon stacks upon stacks of notes, on Torah notes. I once was flipping through them, and I'm reading it. It's written beautiful Hebrew, and it's not clear where the lines even go. I don't even know. Do I go to the next page? Do I go jump here? It's ramblings of a genius mind. And then I asked his wife, my aunt, and she said even he doesn't understand it after he writes it. So she said about it. So while you can have, that's kind of like genius that's caught up in a bottle or in a box that doesn't, and then there's the tremendous marriage of a genius who's able to tailor his writings in a way that's understood by others. Rashi is someone who is able to incorporate tremendous genius in words that are understandable by everyone. and in a way that, like we said, it stales. Anyone who approaches the Torah or the Talmud, Rashi is holding their hand, no matter if they're the beginner of all beginners or if they're the most seasoned scholar around. So the image of Rashi studying by himself in seclusion is a little bit of a dubious one. He lived a long time ago. To say that there's any accurate portrayals of what it looked like it seems like it's unlikely. We know that there's a very, very famous picture of the Rambam as well. Who knows if these things are even accurate? So he spends his years studying in the yeshiva, first in Worms and then in Mainz, and ultimately at the age of 25 he moves back to Troyes, where he were to remain, obviously with the exception of the times where he was escaping, for the rest of his life. Rashi supported himself as a winemaker, a vintner. We know that that part of France it was a main city, and it had lots of orchards and lots of vineyards around, but it also had this fair. There was twice a year that there was a fair, so it was a commercial center. But the Jews at that time were businessmen like they are today, right? Jews we're good at business, and we always were. So that place, whenever you have a convention center that there's a lot of business done, invariably there's going to be a lot of Jews there. And in ancient times, that would also create not only a commercial center, but also a center where a lot of scholarship would happen. Because if all the Jews converge upon a certain city, they kind of turn that city into a Torah center as well. So Rashi was kind of at the, in the middle of all of this, because he did support himself and his family as a winemaker, and also, of course, was the greatest scholar of his generation. As to what exactly did, there's articles written in scholarship as to did he produce the wine? Did he just sell the wine? Was he just a merchant? We know that he did experience some grinding poverty, so maybe he was probably a much better scholar than he was a businessman. Or probably it's more likely that the truth was that he spent so much time studying that he didn't really prioritize his business. Who knows how many great Torah scholars, not quite Rashi's, but how many great Torah scholars, dedicated their minds towards pursuits that brought them away from Torah, and who knows what kind of legacy they could have had, right?
So he didn't put in a full 3-hour workday like Maimonides?
Probably not. A full 3-hour workday.
Much written about his wife?
So there's many legends about primarily his daughters. I don't know if we know much about his wife, but his daughters, there's a lot written about them. They were, in the modern feminists, they love his daughters because there's all these legends that this book of the Talmud wasn't written by Rashi. The Talmud was written by Rashi. It was written by Rashi's daughters. This is written by Rashi's daughters. They wrote that. They studied. They wore tefillin. All these things are unsubstantiated. We don't know much about his daughters. We don't know much facts about his daughters, other than they were his daughters and were married to many of his students, and of course were the forebearers of the great schools of the Tosafos that emerged from Rashi's house, the house of Rashi. Rashi's grandchildren. We know the names of Rashi's grandchildren because they appear in every page of the Talmud in the form of the Tosafos. So we don't know many details. There's, like I said, there's a lot of legend, but not many details of Rashi's family. Even Rashi himself, Rashi's personal life is very unknown. There's, like I said, we don't know if he was a winemaker. Most people say that. Was he a wine merchant? And there's even someone who says he wasn't any of that. He was just a professional rabbi. Who knows? He didn't write an autobiography. It's interesting to kind of wonder how many great Jewish minds were dedicated to pursuits other than Torah, and what the world would have looked like if we had those minds dedicated to Torah. And conversely, if Einstein was in the yeshiva, would he be the best student in the yeshiva? Maybe. Maybe he would have been an average student. His feats of genius and his creativity is something that we find a dime a dozen almost in a yeshiva environment. So who's to say which impact would have been greater if Einstein went to yeshiva or if the yeshiva went to the laboratory, right?
That's why I asked you in the beginning, are we talking about, scriptural time or Rashi's time or contemporary time? Because you could certainly make an argument that Jonas Salk, Einstein, Dr. Edward Teller, guys like that had, at least on our modern society, major impact.
Or look at Karl Marx. Karl Marx, another nice young Jewish boy, but very impactful.
Sure.
Sigmund Freud, right?
Absolutely.
A lot of people like that, but in modern times, it's Jews are innovative and impactful and contribute in a major way to every industry that they partake in.
In the late Middle Ages, religious canonical pursuits were probably the only one which are open to men of genius.
Yes, that's true.
Or
That's true.
some sort of a military thing, and for Jews it's not really an option.
Yes.
Taylor was Jewish?
Dr. Teller, absolutely.
Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was it like in yeshiva? Imagine we took ourselves back and say, okay, we're with Rashi, we're on the same bench as him in the yeshiva, first in Worms, then in Mainz. What's life like, So we know that this is before the printing press. So you're studying the text of the Talmud. What are you studying?
What language would they have been studying in?
You would assume it would be in French.
And
So
then
you'd
if
assume.
you went to Worms, it would have been in German?
Well, I think that was still part of France at that time. But what books are you using? But there's no copies of Babylonian Talmud. So the answer is like this. The first thing that you did when you got to a yeshiva was you copied by hand the entire text of the Talmud, of the tractate, of the book of the Talmud that you're studying. Maybe there was one copy of every other book of Talmud that the entire institution shared. But if you wanted to study, what are you going to study? So you'd copy by hand, copiously, word after word, verbatim, every word of the book.
And how long would it take?
I would probably take a while, right? This is not a small amount of data.
But wasn't paper extremely expensive back then?
And imagine what kind of care and delicacy they would treat their books with. So that's number one. Like, okay, now how accessible is the Torah and the Talmud for us today, and how difficult was it then? And imagine trying to become a scholar in all of Talmud when all you have is a few precious copies of manuscripts of them that may be in your whole town. In your whole town there's one copy of Talmud. And you, someone like Rashi, you knew it all by heart.
You didn't have overhead projectors then either.
Yeah, I don't imagine.
You didn't have the internet. So.
And not only that, so that's where you start with. You have one booklet, one notebook that you have your copy of the Talmud. Maybe if you were really wealthy, you would buy one from an older student. But these things were very precious. And by the way, if a lot of Rashi's contribution is also in trying to find the accurate text of the Torah, of the Talmud, because what happens if everything's copied by hand? How easy is it for a mistake to fall into the text? Obviously, it's exceedingly easy. So you have this one copy, one notebook, covering the tractate, and you have another notebook where you write your notes. So you have a lecture, and the teacher's teaching you, and you're analyzing the text of the Talmud. You're trying to go as deep as you can to understand exactly what's going on, understand the nuance in the words, and you're taking your own notes, and you're explaining what things mean, and you're translating words that you don't understand, and you're explaining what's going on between the lines. Remember, the text of the Talmud it's a very dense book. You're trying to understand everything that's going on between the lines, and every student would compile for themselves what's called a kuntras. Kuntras is the word for a notebook of explanations of what's going on in the Talmud. Now, what Rashi did as a student was he collected all the notebooks of all the students and created a master kuntras, a master notebook that included all of the explanations of all the other students. But not only that, that would be a very, very big notebook. But what he did was he distilled it. He had it sifted through. He edited it. He organized it. He abridged it. He adapted it. He corrected it in a way that he created this kuntrus of all kuntruses, this notebook of all notebooks. And this notebook was the beginning of what we call today Rashi. So like I said, it was a very collaborative effort. It wasn't just Rashi on his own, but it was the understanding of all the students together and all the teachers together, but of course Rashi overseeing it all, and Rashi writing the final text of this copy. And we know this was distributed to his colleagues, to his students, and this became a dominant book of its time. Rashi, at the age...
This area, or is slowly sort of got disseminated?
Oh yeah, so of course it started there, but now it's everywhere, of course. But it started, of course, in France. We know that we already find books that are contemporary to Rashi that they quote the kuntrus. Whenever it says the word the kuntrus, it's referring to Rashi. Even his grandchildren, who wrote the accompanying book, which is called the Tosafot, which is the additions to the kuntrus, additions to the notebook, they refer to their grandfather, not by Rashi says this, rather the kuntrus says this. It became synonymous, right? The understanding, the kuntrus, which was the word that everyone had. Everyone had a kuntrus. But now everyone had the kuntrus, which is the final kind of the best job that anyone's ever done in explaining the Talmud. Thus, when Tosafos wants to ask a question on Rashi, he'll say, the kuntrus says this, but I disagree, or I have a question. What's going on with the kuntrus? Even though they're referring to their own grandfather, who's Rashi.
So when did we start calling it Rashi?
Well, it's still called the kuntrus today, but interesting. We kind of say Rashi, but in the written works of the time, it's called as the kuntrus. I think we do find already of the Rishonim era, so the Middle Ages, some commentaries of the Middle Ages refer to him by Rashi. But certainly in France at that time, it was well known as the kuntrus, and we see kind of how it developed. He got back to Troyes at the age of 25, so that'll be the year 1065, and we know that he refined and re-edited his original copy that he had written as a student, and there was a second, more refined, more perfected edition of his commentary was written then. Of course, Rashi is becoming a household name. Every student who's studying is like, we have this new method. Instead of writing your own kuntrus, you just take the kuntrus, Rashi. And of course, he spread like wildfire throughout France. So when he establishes his yeshiva in Troyes, it becomes the most popular yeshiva of the time. It supplants the institutions that have been around for hundreds of years in Worms and in Mainz, and that becomes the central location of scholarship in France. We know that Rashi spent a third time revising and editing his commentary. There are those that say he did it even a fourth time. But ultimately, the reason why it's so concise and it's so perfect is because he spent really his life doing that, editing and re-editing and perfecting his commentary on the Talmud. There are some books, like I said, and it's amazing how we could suffer today because of what happened. There are those that theorize that the reason why some of his commentaries were copied only once, but weren't perfected a second time or a third time, was because of the Crusades. There are those that theorize that is the reason why, and means it's possible that the reason why we have a hard time today studying the book of Nazir is because of the Crusades. Because they disrupted Rashi's ability to take that particular book and give it a second and a third run through. I have a brother-in-law who just got married a week ago, a week and a half ago, and he's telling me, and he spent his many years in yeshiva, and he completed entire orders of the Talmud. So the Talmud is split into 6 different orders, And he finished 2 of them. And he said, "Do you finish them all?" I said, "No, he still has 40 pages left in the book of Nazir." But it's so hard.
What is that?
Nazir. Nazir covers the laws of a Nazir. Nazir is someone who sets upon himself the oath of Nazirus to spend a minimum of 40 days not drinking wine, not coming in contact with dead people, shaving. Very hard. I studied it. Very hard. And it's compounded by the fact that we have a primitive form of Rashi.
So really, in 900 years, there was no scholar ambitious enough to go say,
Oh,
I will
there-
do it once over,
there-
but it was never accepted at the same level. As
Well, not just it wasn't accepted, no one has the goods. No one could deliver what Rashi delivers. And, you know, in one book, we have the Ran, came a little bit after Rashi, but one of the great rabbis of that era. He wrote a commentary, but his commentary is very different than Rashi because it's so much wordier, so much more verbose. Wherein Rashi would explain everything with 4 words and beautiful. It's just amazing how he's able to.
But still, 900 years, and we had such a bright, shining stars.
Yeah, so we have other stuff, but no
nobody
one did the job. It's amazing. We have in the book of Baba Basra on page 28a, the Rashi's explanation stops, and the work of the Rashbam starts, and it's a different book afterwards. You study it till then, it's one book, and you study the book afterwards, it's a different book. Of course, the text of the Talmud precedes them by 1,000 years. Not quite 1,000, 700 years, but who's counting? Certainly, but Rashi as the accompaniment, when you study the Talmud, you're studying it with Rashi. And then you have Rashi for 28 pages, and suddenly you don't have Rashi anymore. And the Rashbam is good, of course, fantastic, wonderful, but he's not quite the scholar, not scholar, but certainly the commentator that his grandfather was. And it's a different book. And suddenly the pages, if you were to just flip through a Baba Basra, right, you would notice something very interesting. You would notice that in the beginning, the first 28 pages, the pages of the Talmud, like we said, at every page of the Talmud, you have 3 primary sections. You'll have the middle section, which is the actual text of the Talmud. The inner margin is going to be the text of Rashi, and the outer margin is the text of Tosfos. Well, you'll notice the first 28 pages, the text of the Talmud is very big, because Rashi is always very succinct. You get to 28 pages, some of the pages shrink, because the commentary of the Rashbam, to try to do Rashi's job, he couldn't do it in the same amount with the same limitations that Rashi placed upon himself in writing things as succinctly as Rashi did, and therefore the pages shrink because the commentary takes up more of the page. Okay, so Rashi, of course, wrote on all of Tanakh, and like we said, it's remarkable that the very first time a young student starts studying Chumash and you start studying Genesis, you read it with Rashi, and the last time you do it as an advanced scholar, you would also study with Rashi. Some of the techniques of Rashi, he would answer a question by just answering. And there's a book written in English, interesting book. It's called What's Bothering Rashi? Which sounds bizarre. It's a bizarre thing. If you've never been inside the walls of a yeshiva, that title is a bizarre title for a book. But if you spent even a half hour in yeshiva, it makes a lot of sense. Because the way to fully appreciate the commentary of Rashi is to ask that question. Why is Rashi saying what he's saying? Because very frequently, he's invoking a question that he's not even writing. And he's telling you the answer, and why are you telling me this? Oh, because you had a question. There was something that was bothering Rashi. The text of the Torah, the text of the Talmud, there's an obvious question that's unnamed, and Rashi's giving you the answer without even giving the question. So this book is like, okay, let's try to deconstruct every Rashi and see, well, what was his problem? What was his premise? And thus, what's his solution? But he writes it all in 4 words.
It's the original Jeopardy.
The original Jeopardy, yeah, it's interesting. I always like to talk about this Rashi, for example, to give you guys another illustration. We talk about the 10 plagues at the beginning of our discussion. And so you asked about the 10 plagues, Janet, and if you look at there's a one-word Rashi, which are always the best, right? One-word Rashi, where the 10th plague, death of the firstborn. And, of course, in the middle of the night, all the firstborn die, and Pharaoh gets up and is frantically looking for Moshe. Get at her quickly, right? So, Vayakam Paro, and Pharaoh got up. Rashi says one word, mimitaso, which means from his bed. And it goes on to tell us what everything happened. And, like I said, what's bothering Rashi? Like, well, what's Rashi adding? Pharaoh was sleeping in a bed. He wasn't sleeping on a sofa. What's going on over here? Right? But if you actually understand what Rashi is telling you, you find a whole other element to the whole story. Moses goes and tells Pharaoh that in the middle of the night, all the firstborn are going to die. What happens in the middle of the night? All the firstborn die. And Pharaoh gets up from his bed. What does it tell us about Pharaoh?
He was not firstborn.
Well, he was firstborn, but despite having 9 perfectly prophetic examples of the prescience of Moshe, he was calm enough to be sleeping in bed. So Rashi just now, with one word, gives us an entire perspective of the whole episode. I give you another example here. Jacob is about to die in the Genesis. He calls over Joseph and tells him and makes him swear that you're not going to bury me in Egypt, take me to Israel, bury me with my father and grandfather in the Maras Machpelah, in this cave that they bought. Bury me there. So Rashi says he calls over to Joseph, he who has the ability to make it happen. Right? So, what's Rashi adding? Jacob is about to die. He knows he's about to die. He calls over Joseph. He makes a request from Joseph. Rashi says, he asks Joseph because Joseph has the ability to effect change. Well, of course Joseph has the ability. He's the king, right? What's he adding to the story? It seems to me, this is my interpretation of Rashi, that Rashi has a question and he's giving you the answer. And the question that Rashi has, but remember, is unnamed. It's not mentioned. The question Rashi has is that Jacob went down this route before of preferring Joseph to the rest of the brothers. And how did that end? Pretty poorly. And the question that Rashi is asking is, wait a minute. Jacob has 12 able-bodied children. And the last time that he gave preferential treatment to Joseph, it was disastrous. Why is Jacob suddenly going to ask Joseph, again, seemingly making the same mistake he did prior? And he's answering by telling you that Joseph was unique because he was the only one that could affect that change. What it's telling us is that Jacob indeed made a change in how he treated his children. Jacob started off and he preferred Joseph and he gave him the nice tunic and he would study with him and he was his favorite. And then it caused a tremendous disaster. You know, Joseph had the dreams, of course, and ultimately it ended up with Joseph being 22 years away from his father and all the tribulations that brought the Jewish people to Israel. Jacob took that to heart and said, I am no longer going to give preferential treatment to any of my children. So why is he suddenly asking Joseph and not anyone else? Because Joseph had the ability to effect change. So 4 words, Rashi's telling you a question, an answer, a perspective on the transformation of Jacob. And that's on every page of the Torah and every page of the Talmud. Certainly, Rashi was, like we said, maybe was he a genius? I think it's quite, I don't know of anyone that would imagine otherwise. Rashi knew all of Tanakh by heart. He would be able to tell you any time a word appears in Tanakh. Rashi was able to study all of Talmud and write a commentary that makes it possible for us today to study Talmud and makes it wonderful. Like there's a certain beauty of Rashi's commentary. It's very frequently like Rashi rephrases something where he enlivens the book. Whatever text you're trying to understand, Rashi will present it in a certain way that makes it beautiful. Like we said, I think it's a very fair thing to say is that Jewish learning would be impossible without Rashi. The Torah is not written with punctuation. The Talmud is certainly not written with punctuation. Rashi will tell you as follows: like, this is a question, or this is being asked in wonderment, or there's a surprise, or he'll give you the context. He'll say, well, the Talmud in a few pages will discuss that. Anytime Rashi tells you, by the way, you have a Mishnah and you have the Gemara. The Talmud will further ask this question, or the Gemara will explain. The Gemara later on will explain this. Talmud later on will explain this. That too is a question. That too is saying, logically, there's a question that's obvious right here. And by the way, I usually answer those kinds of questions. But because the Talmud itself will do it later on, I'm going to tell you, wait, the question will be answered by the Talmud himself. Rashi's like, now everyone's always scared of spoilers, right? So you're watching a television series, Bernie. Like, don't tell me the spoilers. Oh, don't tell me. Right? Everyone's obsessed with spoilers. Rashi was the first one to tell you this spoiler alert. The Talmud will ask that question. So when you see a Rashi that says the Talmud will explain what's going on over here, you have to realize that Rashi's asking a question that really you should be asking as well. And he's telling you, normally I fulfill the role of asking this question that's unnamed and giving you the answer, but because the Talmud itself will ask that, hold on, wait for it. I was once studying. I remember as a very young child, I was studying Chumash, the Torah, with Rashi, and with my dad. I must have been 7 or whatever. And he said to me, the next Rashi is a very, very important Rashi. What could it be, right? Well, what's Rashi saying? So the next Rashi, we read the next Rashi. Eini Odeya Pirusho. I don't know what this means. Several times Rashi says, I don't know. And indeed, we could echo the words of the Talmud. A person should get used to saying, I don't know. That is a very, very good explanation or answer to a question. It's a very good answer to a question. To say, I don't know, it's a good answer. You don't have to know everything. And it's amazing. Rashi, how's about Rashi doesn't know? Rashi is teaching us also a lesson as well. Maybe if you don't know, don't write a commentary, right? You don't know? Okay, we'll skip that one. No. He said, I don't know, and I'm going to write it, I don't know, and you to know that it's okay to know to know that you don't know. That too is a lesson. And indeed, maybe those Rashis teach us more than any other Rashis. There's a remarkable... Go ahead.
This is my question. In Hebrew, what we read last night says on Isaac, Abraham, which says, please bring your only son that you love.
Your firstborn, yes.
Yeah, but the word please, is that in Hebrew?
The word na.
It means.
Yes. You can take a look at that Rashi. I would advise you to look at that Rashi. See what he says.
Please,
Rashi's son-in-law, his sons-in-law were great scholars of their own right. The various gaps of his of scholarship that we don't have are filled in by his sons-in-law. So there's a very interesting little eulogy that his son-in-law gives for him. In the book of Makros, page 19b, the book only goes to page 24. So 19b, it says as follows. So Rashi is saying the last word that Rashi writes is tahor. Tahor means pure. There's a discussion about a certain kind of law of purity and impurity. Rashi says is the theme that Rashi ends with is pure. So the text of Rashi continues, our teacher, his body was pure and his soul left with purity. And he didn't elaborate, he didn't explain, he didn't comment any further. From here, henceforth, is the words of his student, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Nassan, which was his son-in-law. What's interesting is that if you just read that, it's a nice little send-off to Rashi. The Rashi, it's just incidentally, the last word that he writes was the word tahor, and then he died. But what I discovered, maybe other people knew this as well, that there's a whole Talmud in the book of Sanhedrin that has a discussion about the death of Rabbi Eliezer. If you remember, we talked about Rabbi Akiva, his teacher was Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is one of the great tragedies in Jewish history because he had a disagreement with his brother-in-law about the status of a certain oven, and they disagreed so fiercely that he was excommunicated because he refused to accept the opinion of his brother-in-law, who was the head of the Sanhedrin. And in fact, even though Rabbi Eliezer brought what to us would be irrefutable evidence that he's right, still, in order to preserve the authority of the Sanhedrin, it became clear that unless he submits, he was going to be excommunicated. In fact, Rabbi Eliezer himself, he brought evidence. He's like, if I'm right, let the waters of the river start flowing the opposite direction. And suddenly the river starts flowing the opposite direction, and people say, sorry, it's not a proof. And it's like, if I'm right, let there be a heavenly prophetic call that I'm right, and suddenly everyone hears a booming sound, Rabbi Eliezer wrong, you guys are wrong, listen to him, and they say, sorry, Torah is not in heavens, if we disagree with you, doesn't matter what you find, this heavenly voice says. And he says to them, if I'm right, you see that tree? And they see a carob tree. And he said, let it be uprooted and let it move 100 mil away. Suddenly the tree gets uprooted and it gets moved to the other side of town.
Global warming.
And he's like, if I'm right, let the walls of the Beis Medrash cave in, let the walls of the house of scholarship cave in. Suddenly the walls start caving in. And the walls forever will remain like that, caved in. Sorry, that's the Gemara says. This is a story written, documented in contemporary to those people. And the walls start caving in, and sorry, it's not a proof, and if refusing to submit, I don't care what proofs you bring, you're excommunicated. So the rest of his life he was excommunicated. And the Talmud talks about what happens when he was very sick, and all his students came to visit him. And he was sitting in his room, and they, of course, sat down, but they had to sit down 4 amos away from him. The laws of an excommunicated person is that you can't sit next to them. You have to sit like 8 feet away from them. So they sit down.
Is that civil or religious or both?
It's religious. It's religious law. But religious law in the religious, when the Jews have sovereignty over Israel, even though at that time it wasn't clear if they actually had sovereignty, but the Jewish law was, I guess those two were indistinguishable. So they sit 4 feet away from him, 4 amos away from him, and he says to them, why do you guys come to visit me? And he says to them, we came to study Torah. She says, why didn't you come till now? So they respond, we didn't have any time. And then Rabbi Eliezer tells to all the people, I will be shocked if any one of you die a natural death. Mind Rabbi Eliezer tells you that. This is the guy who caved the walls of the Beis Medrash and made the river flow the other way. That's not the words you want to hear from him, right? You want to hear you should live and be well and be prosperous. That's what you want to be. That's what you want to hear. And then he says, the first thing they sit down, I will be shocked if any of you die a natural death. And Rabbi Akiva tells him, what about my death? He says, your death is worse than all of theirs. Imagine how devastating that would be to hear that. And then, this is a very long narrative. Rabbi Eliezer,
have insurance companies at the time?
That might be a good idea, huh? Yeah. To beef up your insurance policy. Catastrophic insurance. Rabbi Eliezer picks up his 2 arms, and he puts them on his heart, and he says to them, woe unto you! My 2 arms are like 2 Torah scrolls. I studied a lot of Torah, and I taught a lot of Torah. I studied a lot of Torah, but I did not diminish from my teachers any more than a dog diminishes from an ocean by licking it. If you take a dog and you bring him to Venice Beach in California, they start lapping up some water from the Pacific Ocean. How much water is that? How much smaller is the ocean now?
Considering
Nothing.
the ocean is made of salt and a dog probably wouldn't lap it to start with.
Well, okay, but theoretically.
Special dogs in Israel.
It wouldn't make it much smaller.
Sorry about that.
That's fair. You go to a freshwater lake.
It certainly wouldn't get rid of the to be politically correct, artistic people going up and down.
That's fair.
So,
You take your dog to Lake Ontario.
Okay, no,
Fair?
We're good. Just, sorry,
And the dog started lapping up some water. How much smaller is the lake? How much? It's nothing. So he says to them, I studied a lot from my teachers, but the amount of Torah that they had, and compared to what I received from them, it's like the few little flecks of water that the dog laps up from the ocean. I taught so much Torah, but none of my students diminished for me any more than a paintbrush dipped into a jar of paint. Not only that, he goes on to just talk about the scholarship, and I taught 300 laws, the laws of a saras, of a splotch of skin, and no one asked me about him, and I taught 300 laws, and maybe even 3,000 laws of what happens of the obscure laws of sorcery and how you get an entire field to suddenly be populated with cucumbers. Very obscure law, and no one even asked me about it.
But the only way to get Torah into your soul is drop by drop.
Fair. That's very fair. Well, there's a lot of stuff going on over here, clearly, right? But he's making this announcement. He's very sick, and he's telling these people they're going to die an unnatural death, and he starts lamenting the fact they didn't have any real students. And he says, no one asked me about it, besides for Rabbi Akiva, who was actually sitting in front of him. Once we were walking together, and Rabbi Akiva told me, Rebbe, teacher, teach me about how to plant cucumbers, which means teach me the laws of sorcery. And one of the common sorcery methods was to suddenly take a field and populate it with cucumbers. And I was walking to Rabbi Akiva, and he asked me about that. I said one word, and suddenly the field next to me got full of cucumbers. And then Rabbi Akiva said to him, okay, Rebbe, you taught me how to plant them. How do you uproot them? I said one more thing, and they all got bunched together in the middle.
No wonder I don't like cucumbers.
That's
I know
he
their
finished.
connection with sorcery.
He finished. He finished his rant. He's finished his rant, and they started asking him about different, very obscure laws of purity and impurity. And they set a list of things here. Rashi tells us what these things even mean. If you just read this, I don't know how you, back to our example. And they asked him about all these very obscure stuff, and they asked him about one thing, and he said, Tahar, it's pure, and he died. And the Gemara says, once again, the Gemara gives the same eulogy to Rabbi Eliezer that Rashi's student gives to him. He says, he said the word tahar, pure, and his soul departed in purity. And they all got up, all his students, Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Akiva, and they undid the excommunication. And now that he died, they undid his excommunication. Of course, it's a very emotional, very tragic Gemara. But either way, I was thinking it's just amazing. We're describing Rashi with the same venerance that we're giving to Rebbe Eliezer, just that he died in purity, which is just, if you think about that, it's just a remarkable thing to say about someone. The legacy of Rashi, of course, we could talk about it in any terms you want to couch about Torah scholarship today, or Torah scholarship throughout history. Or even anything that we're doing today, like any scholarship that we have, the Jews have today, the fact that the Torah is accessible, to whatever degree it still is accessible to us, is largely, in Torah learning, is largely due to Rashi. I would say that Torah observance and Torah practice is largely due to the Rambam. The debate that we can have today about their impact is maybe only academic, because either one is impossible without the other. You can have Torah observance certainly without Torah scholarship, and you can have Torah scholarship in a vacuum. We treat Torah as the Word of God. You want to demote it to being any sort of domain, any sort of other form of study, other wisdom that is taking Torah and making it not Torah. Who's to say what the world would look like without Rashi? It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine what scholarship today will be without Rashi, just like it's hard to imagine what Jewish life today will be without the Rambam. We know immediately after his life, his school that he established flourished and grew. Of course, obviously, it was not an easy time to be a Jew, but we have hundreds upon hundreds of students that he left and his disciples and his quoted by his contemporaries. But I think to answer the question that we started off with, and that is, why is Rashi relevant today? That question is essentially the same question as why is Jewish learning relevant today? The Torah is a book that's, according to Jewish tradition, 3,300 years old for us and even precedes the world. The Talmud is 1,500 years old. What's the relevance of those books today? And indeed, that's an argument we could have. I know that Dan wants to have a series that we do here, Why We Study Torah, because I'm in the middle of a series elsewhere. I just finished part 10 last week of Why We Study Torah. I have right now collected, I have 26 reasons why we study Torah. And this is not just about reasons that apply to reasons that apply today. And to think about trying to do that without Rashi is unimaginable. So we could say that Rashi today is as relevant as he ever was, because Jewish learning never stops, because the world depends upon Jewish learning. We believe as Jews, the Talmud makes it clear, that if there was even 1 second where there was no one studying Torah, we have a world that abandoned its purpose. Thus the world would cease to exist. There's a verse in the Torah, the Talmud makes it clear in the book of Shabbos, 88, in the book of Nedarim, 32. What's clear is that Jewish learning is what's keeping the world alive. For someone to say, well, these people are studying Torah, what are they contributing to society? What they don't realize is they're contributing life to society. The only reason why the rest of us could exist is because some people are dedicating themselves to Torah study, thus to improving the world, to bring morality to the world, to bring God to the world, to bring Tikkun Olam to the world. If we abandon that, we're abandoning our mission as a species, and certainly as a people. And that is made possible due to the efforts of Rashi. So I think we could make the argument that Rashi indeed is the most impactful person that has lived in the past 1,000 years, but even today is impactful. Not because of his contributions 1,000 years ago, but because what he enables us to do today. And I think we have to be very thankful and appreciative of Rashi for what he did, and we should, I would maybe make a clarion call for us to get our hands on a book of Rashi. Get our hands on this. Now Rashi has been translated. It's very easy to have access to Rashi because it's been translated.
I think I brought in here one day that the book with the Rashi commentary on it, which is the only way I can study it by myself, because otherwise Torah makes absolutely no sense.
Right. The Torah is a book unlike any other. It's very dense, and there's a lot that's not being written, a lot being hinted to with an introduction. We had this in last week's parsha. The verse talks about, we had 100 examples in last week's parsha, but the verse talks about when you go into the land of Israel, and you'll have the laws of tzaras in the house. And look at Rashi there. I'm not going to spoil it for you. But look at Rashi there. He explains, and remember, he only explains, if you ask the question, what's bothering Rashi, what's actually bothering Rashi is, why is there this preamble when you go to the land of Israel? And see what he answers. Very interesting. But Jewish learning today is made possible because of Rashi, and we are very, very appreciative to him today because he is one of the major reasons why humanity has hope. Yes?
Well, that's what's bothering Mary Lou. That whole thing. You said that the Torah is God's word.
Yes.
Just as much as the Tanakh is God's word.
Fair.
Okay. We're studying the Song of Solomon.
Yes.
And the Song of Solomon in my Tanakh has Rashi putting it in an allegorical type interpretation
Yes.
of it. And I'm reading it from my Tanakh here on my iPad. And they're totally different stories. I mean, words that he uses, he has Torah in there many times. He has Moses and Aaron in here. He has, just tremendous amount of information. It's just not here.
Okay, so I'm gonna critique your question.
The explanations of the explanation.
I said, first of all, like this. When we say that the Torah is the word of God and we say that the Tanakh is the word of God, I said it's fair. It's fair to say, but it's actually not quite the same. The Torah is the direct word of God, whereas the Tanakh, the Nevi'im, the word means God's not the author of the Song of Songs. The author is someone who is a prophet, but he's not the author, right? We don't look at Moshe as being the author of any book. Maybe he wrote some other book that we don't have access to. But Moshe is maybe the scribe, the stenographer, the typist. God dictates to him and he actually writes it. But he's not the author because he doesn't have any editorial oversight or control to the book. That being said, Rashi's role, where he writes, I'll give you a place to look at, where he writes what his role is as a commentator on the Torah and certainly on the Tanakh as well, is to explain the pshat. The Torah has, if it's the word of God like you would read it was, then it's going to be maybe perhaps different than other books. So there could be multiple layers of meaning. So we talk about pshat, remez, drash, and sod, the four simplistic or the four categories of meanings that exist within all of Torah. Rashi tells us, and I'll give you a source to look at, Genesis 3:8. Rashi's comment on Genesis 3:8, where he tells us, my goal is to give you pshat. There's many, many realms of drash and sod, and certainly remez as well, different realms of, different planes of Torah study. Rashi is going to give you pshat, the way to understand it, the only way to understand it on a simplistic level. Or not the only way, or his way to understand it on a simplistic level. Frequently, you'll have to invoke the Medrash for that. Now, the Song of Songs, pshat doesn't mean literal. The word pshat means the basic understanding, but does not necessarily mean the literal understanding. So, while Rashi will not give you necessarily the literal understanding, sometimes the literal understanding is the pshat. Rashi is going to give you the pshat. What pshat is a good question. But when you look at a Song of Songs, so it has a literal translation, Rashi obviously deduced that the literal translation of the words is not the pshat. Thus, when he gives you the allegorical understanding, clearly he understood that the allegorical understanding is the most simple way to understand within the realm of pshat. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. That's that, guys. I would encourage everyone to get their hands on a copy of Rashi and maybe read something and ask and try to kind of go through the way he looks at it. Try to work it out with him. Try to say, okay, he had this verse, we had the same verse, and he's approaching it from this angle. Why? Like, why is he asking this? Why is he not asking that? Why is he taking it with this maybe approach which seems to be distant from the actual words? Obviously understood that this is the pshat. Why? And to do that gives you like a deeper appreciation of Rashi. But either way, I think the takeaway from us today is that Jewish study was impacted by Rashi perhaps more than anyone else, certainly over the last 1,000 years. Its accessibility on one hand, understanding of the words, understanding of the words between the words, but also not limited to simplistic understanding, also a companion of the greatest scholar of the time approaches Rashi with the same venerance and submission that we have to do as the earliest of beginners. I encourage everyone to get your hands on a copy of a book of Rashi and see for yourself why he remains as popular as ever today, almost 1,000 years after he was born and 900 years and change after he passed away.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you guys. Everyone have a wonderful Pesach. And I look, oh wow, it's clapping. I look forward to seeing you guys very soon. Go ahead. Oh, there you go. What is this? This is Steinsaltz. Okay.
I've heard of Steinholtz. What is Steinholtz?
Yeah, so so this is.
uncompleted. I mean, they couldn't afford to finish publishing it.
Here, look.
So this
He
is
actually
a
brings
Rashi
Rashi. You see that?
Yeah, but then they put it in Hebrew, right? So, and he actually wrote
So-
in French. So why? Where? I mean,
No,
so where
Rashi
is-
wrote it in Hebrew.
He wrote in Hebrew.
Rashi wrote in Hebrew. Yes. He might have spoken to his
Okay,
students
I got it.
in
But he
French,
wrote-
but he wrote in Hebrew.
So what I need to do is get the
So
translation of
this there isn't a book of translation of Rashi on the Talmud in Hebrew. However, on the Torah there is.
Okay. That's a good starting spot.
That's a good starting spot. And just read the verse and try to first read the verse and then say, okay, let's see what Rashi says, and then try to read the verse again with Rashi.
Yeah, I mean, the last two parshas, I've been. You get tricked into saying, well, if Maimonides had been writing this today, what would he write? And that's what you addressed that at the beginning. You said
Yes.
he would probably write the same thing.
Yeah.
Maybe the words would be a little bit